Hello, welcome to Introduction to Christianity 2, Lecture 12, Christianity in Asia. My name is Reverend Christian Zebley. Thank you for tuning in for this video lecture for our focus today on Christianity in Asia from Global Gospel Chapter 6. I'm really glad to see you today via video format. I do miss seeing you on WebEx in real-time classes, but with the current internet issues, it seems it's better to move to a video format. So thanks for tuning in. I want to encourage you and remind you that next week we will not have a video lecture on July 28th, 2020, next Tuesday. And I'd like you to spend that time working on your church worship reports. I'll have more information about that at the end of this video lecture and also on Course Power. I'd like you to work on those next week, July 28th, and so we will not have a video lecture next week. So thanks for tuning in today as we jump into Christianity in Asia. I'm going to spend a few minutes reviewing the material from last week on Christianity in Europe, and then the majority of this video lecture will be about the growth of Christianity in Asia over the centuries, a time that has been both a period of growth and decline. But as we will see in today's lecture, in the current period we're living in, we are living in a time where Christianity is growing in Asia. So thanks for tuning in. I'm going to turn my video off for the majority of the lecture, and I will come back on at the end of the lecture. So thanks for joining us today. As you may remember in this class, we are looking at Christianity as a global, diverse, multicultural religious movement, roughly 2.6 billion Christians in the world, which is roughly 1/3 of the world's population of 7.8 billion. So Christianity is the world's largest religion. We've looked at this slide many times, but just as a reminder, in 2015, the distribution of world Christians was flat in the sense that in previous centuries, a majority of Christians could be found in Europe or Asia. Today, that distribution is flat, with Europe having 25% of world Christians, Africa having 25%, and the number in Asia being only 15%, but that is significant. North America being 10% of world Christians, and Latin America at 25%. So we can see that there are actually more Christians in Asia than in North America. Briefly, let's have a review of what we looked at last week with Lecture 11 with Christianity in Europe. Europe has a population of roughly 747 million people, 51 independent states, and an area roughly 10 million square kilometers. Here's a map of modern Europe from Scandinavia in the north to Italy, Spain, and Turkey in the south, Russia in the east, and the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Iceland in the west. And I'm sure many of you in this class have traveled to Europe. I've also traveled there several times in my life, and I find it to be a beautiful and culturally diverse place. Now, last week we looked at how Christianity spread under the Roman Empire throughout much of Europe, and the green areas show the growth of Christianity in Europe by the time of Constantine in 325 AD, who was the Roman emperor who made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So we can see that Christianity has grown to these green regions by the time of Constantine in 325 AD. Then this map shows the growth of Christianity throughout Europe by 1100 AD, and we can see that by 1100 AD, that Christianity has traveled to all of Europe that we would know of today. Although we can't see Iceland in this picture, but we see Christianity as far north as the Scandinavian countries, in the east in Russia, and then also down through the Middle East and North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. So we can see that by 1100 AD, Christianity has extended to almost all of Europe that we would know of today. And last week we looked at the fact that in 1500 AD, the majority of the world's Christians live in Europe. 80% live in Europe in 1500 AD. This is a time when cathedrals were being built, Christian theology and universities are flourishing, and yet, as we looked at last week, Christianity in Europe will decline in the next 500 years, so that in 2019, only 25% of world Christians live in Europe. So from 1500 AD to 2019, we see a major decline from majority of world's Christians living in Europe, 80% in 1500 to only 25% in 2019. We also looked at last week some of the great historical happenings that helped to form the church in Europe, one of them being the Great Schism in 1054 AD, when the Roman Empire, the Catholics in the Roman Empire break off from the Orthodox in the Byzantine Empire. And so that split then becomes a split that later forms this Orthodox Eastern Europe and Catholic Western Europe. So major happening in the church in 1054 with the Great Schism between the Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox Church in the East. We also discussed the Protestant Reformation, which is kicked off by Martin Luther in 1517 when he nails the 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg. And the Protestant Reformation then begins a process that later creates what we would know as Protestant Europe. Luther had very revolutionary ideas, although his intention was not to start his own church, the Lutheran Church, or to start a Protestant church. His intention was to reform the Roman Catholic Church. And his revolutionary ideas, we've discussed this in the past, would be grace alone, that we're saved by grace alone, through faith alone, that faith is a gift that God gives us to experience his grace, and that our ultimate authority of Christians rests not in the Pope or the church structure, but in the authority of the Bible, which is known as sola scriptura. So grace alone, saved by grace through faith, and this is not of ourselves, it is the gift of God, so that no one can boast, which we've read in Ephesians 2, 8 through 9. Saved by grace through faith, faith alone, sola fide, which is a gift that God gives us so that we can believe in Christ. And then our authority rests in the Bible alone, sola scriptura. So these happenings, the Great Schism in 1054, and then the Protestant Reformation beginning in 1517, eventually produce what we looked at, three different Christian Europes, which developed between 1650 and 1900. Orthodox Eastern Europe, Catholic Western Europe, and Protestant Northern Europe. Here's a map that shows that, so we can see here to the right in the orange areas, Eastern Europe, with the Eastern European countries here moving east into Russia, everything in the orange area being predominantly Eastern Orthodox, and then to the left here in the blue area, Roman Catholic Europe, from Poland all the way here to Spain and Portugal. And then in the northern areas from Germany into Scandinavia and the UK and up to Iceland, we see Protestant Northern Europe. So three distinct Christian Europes: Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant. Then at the end of our lecture last week, we discussed some events that really contributed to the great decline of Christianity in Europe in the 20th century. Several major events, and we looked at that in a little more detail last week. World War I, where millions died, followed by World War II and the Jewish Holocaust, where millions died again, and 6 million Jewish people were murdered by the Nazi regime. Very catastrophic events that shook the faith of many Europeans, as well as the rise of communist Eastern Europe with its emphasis on atheism, and then also secularization, which is the movement in which people move away from religion to a more secular understanding of society, which has been encouraged by the embrace of science. Although I've said several times that faith and science can be integrated and are actually asking similar questions. But these events, World War I, World War II, and the Holocaust, the rise of communist Eastern Europe, secularization, and the embrace of science lead to the Europe we know today, which is very secular. And this is a popular picture that people use to describe secularism, of someone throwing away the world religions. It's not a great picture, but it's accurate to how many people feel. And Dr. Jacobson defines secularism for us as religion is less visible, less pervasive, and less influential than in the past. What that results in is a European Christianity today where contemporary Europeans are the least religiously active Christians in the world. Less than 10% attend worship services weekly, and levels of belief in God are low. And as Jacobson shows us on page 107, he writes, 200 years ago, Europe ruled the world and governed the global Christian movement. Now it is merely one center of Christianity alongside many others, and European Christianity is diminished. And yet, at the end of our lecture, we also notice that there are many immigrants coming into Europe, and a 2012 study showed that 39% of European immigrants are Muslim, and 42% of European immigrants are Christian. So what's resulted in that, we read in Global Gospel, is that African or Asian congregations can now be found in all the major cities in Western and Eastern Europe. So there are, in some cases, very vibrant Christian congregations founded and made up of predominantly immigrants, such as the Kingsway International Christian Center that was founded by Nigerian pastor Matthew Ashimolowo, that has 12,000 weekly worshipers. He founded that church in 1992. So this is an example. It's not the mainstream, but there are examples of immigrant-based churches in major European cities, which is a sign that Christianity actually may move into a time of revival and growth in Europe in the coming years as many immigrants are coming to Europe. I'd now like to continue with the main theme for our lecture today, Christianity in Asia. Asia is made up of a population of roughly 4.5 billion people. That is huge. That is 60% of the world's population, 4.5 billion people. And within Asia are 49 countries recognized by the United Nations, with a massive size of 44,579,000 square kilometers. That is 30% of Earth's total land area. So we see that although the number of Christians in Asia may not be equal to other parts of the world like Africa and Latin America, in terms of population and size, Asia is a huge area of the world. 60% of world population, 30% of Earth's total land area. In Global Gospel on page 172, we see the breakdown of continents by world population. Asia comes in at number 1 with 60% of world population. Africa with 16% of world population. Europe with only 10% of world population. Latin America with 9% of world population. And North America with the smallest amount at 5% of world population within these continents. Here's a map of modern Asia. So we see in the far north, Russia, Indonesia in the south, Japan and South Korea in the east, and the Saudi Arabian Peninsula and Palestine and Turkey in the west. So it's a huge area of the world. 60% of world population and roughly 30% of the world's total land area. Now, there are different ways of breaking Asia down into different regions. One way here is Northern Asia with Russia in Northern Asia. Then we see Eastern Asia with Mongolia, China, Korea, and Japan. Then Southeast Asia with Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia. And then Southern Asia being India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. And then Central Asia, in this area, which would be Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and other Central Asian countries. And then Western Asia, which would be made up of Turkey, Iraq, and the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. So this is one way people have tried to divide up Asia into these subcontinents. Jacobson tells us in Global Gospel, pages 163 and 64, in describing Asia, he says, Asia is a vast region that includes 1/3 of all the land in the world. It is also home to more different cultures and languages than the rest of the world combined. Asia is so diverse that it may be helpful to view the region as consisting of 4 different subcontinents rather than a single massive supercontinent. Then also on page 164, Jacobson describes Asia in terms of 4 Asias, with Islamic West Asia, which would be what we understand as the Middle East today, the Saudi Arabian Peninsula and Palestine, which is only 4% Christian, and it's majority Muslim. Then Buddhist secular East Asia, which today is 10% Christian, and some countries like South Korea have a Christian population of 30%. And Jacobson notes that Christianity is growing more quickly in China, Japan, Mongolia, North and South Korea, and Taiwan than anywhere else in Asia. So this area of Asia has the quickest Christian growth, with some countries like South Korea with 30% Christian population. Then Hindu South Asia, which would be India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, that area, is only 4% Christian. And in India, 75% of the Christian population are Dalit Christian minorities. And if you read Global Gospel, you learned about the Dalit people who are at the bottom of the caste system in India. They're actually considered lower than the caste system. They are considered untouchables. I had the privilege of visiting a Dalit Christian community in India in 2012. So those groups in India have identified with the gospel of Christ. Then religiously mixed Southeast Asia, that is 20% Christian, if you include the Philippines, which has a huge Christian population. So Southeast Asia then would have the highest Christian population within Asia. But again, Buddhist secular East Asia, that Japan is included in, is the fastest growing Christian region in Asia. So I thought this was helpful, the way Jacobson divides Asia into these 4 Asias: Islamic West Asia, Buddhist secular East Asia, Hindu South Asia, and the religiously mixed Southeast Asia, where Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity all coexist, as well as other local religions. Now, in this course, we've discussed many times the 4 traditions within Christianity of Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Protestantism, and Pentecostalism. And all 4 of these traditions are alive and well in Asia today. We can see here this picture of a Mass in China, where people are waiting to receive communion from the priests, the Mass. This is a picture of a young Orthodox priest in Tajikistan. They're in Central Asia. You can see the icons here and his beard, which is often the sign of an Orthodox priest. And then we also have a picture here of a large Presbyterian church in Seoul, Korea. I am a pastor in the Presbyterian church tradition, and there are many Presbyterians as well as other Protestants and Catholics in Korea, but you can find large Protestant churches like this in Korea. And then Asia has many, many Pentecostals, and this is a picture of Pentecostals at a large megachurch in Singapore. So all four Christian traditions are alive and well in Asia: Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Protestantism, and Pentecostalism, which, as we've discussed before, is a movement made up of both Protestants and Pentecostals, those who identify with a more expressive form of Christian worship, emphasis on the Holy Spirit, on signs and wonders and miracles, and very dynamic worship services, where in some cases people get on their knees to pray. We've seen this in Africa and Latin America as well. Also, I'd like to emphasize that in Japan, we have all four traditions in Japan: Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, which is a much more minor movement in Japan, many Protestants, and Pentecostals. And this is a picture of I believe, a Protestant church doing a gospel music workshop somewhere near Nagoya. So in Japan, where we don't have a majority Christian population, we have a minority Christian population, and people argue what that number is. Some say it's 2%. I've heard others say it could be as high as 4%, but it is a minority Christian population. But all four traditions of Christianity are present in Japan today. Now let's move into discussing more specifically the history of Christianity in Asia. And Jacobson makes it clear on page 147. He says to us, Asian Christian history has been characterized by a series of fluctuations between expansion and contraction, which is very different from the historic growth patterns in Europe, Africa, and the Americas. So in English, we use these words expansion and contraction. I think another maybe easier way to understand that would be growth and decline. So there, as we're going to look here together, and if you read Global Gospel chapter 6, it was a thick chapter, but if you read it, you saw the several eras of growth and decline. So in Asia, uniquely in the world, Christianity advances and then it retreats. It expands and then it contracts. It grows and then it declines. And we know from the very beginning of Christianity that Christianity was present in Asia because Jesus was Asian. He was a Palestinian Jew. So Jesus would be considered an Asian person. So Christianity begins in Asia. And then many believe that the Apostle Thomas, one of the original apostles of Jesus, possibly came to India in the 1st century. And so the Indian church can trace itself back to the early apostolic period. And I do believe that that happened, although the scholarship is difficult to prove that conclusively. But I think it's very possible that Thomas made it as far as India in the 1st century. Asia is also the region of the world that had the first Christian nation, when in 301 AD, Armenia adopted Christianity as their official religion before the Roman Empire, which would do so several years later. Armenia was the first country in the world to adopt Christianity as their official religion. And so as Jacobson shows us on page 148, Christianity is often understood as a foreign religion in Asia, but that's not true. There were actually more Christians in Asia up until 900 AD than any other part of the world. That's on page 148. Okay, so let's now begin to look a little more closely at these different periods of expansion and growth, and also periods of contraction or decline. So the first period of expansion that includes the birth of Christianity in Palestine would be the first expansion from the birth of Jesus to 500 AD. And so Christianity is born Asian Palestine, and then moves into modern-day Iran and Iraq and the Persian Empire. And the church that develops there is the Church of the East, the Nestorian church that fought many conflicts with Zoroastrians. Many were killed, but the Church of the East flourishes, and it's known today as the Nestorian Church. Another Christian tradition that develops in this part of the world is called the Miaphysite tradition, which today would include the Armenian Apostolic Church and the Syrian Orthodox Church. And this tradition is unique in the sense that it has a heavy emphasis on the divine nature of Christ. So all Christians look at Christ being both God and man, his divine and his human nature, but this tradition has a very heavy emphasis on the divinity of Christ. Then we move into a second expansion of Christianity into Asia from 500 AD to 1000. And this is when Christianity begins to travel along the Silk Road. And if you read the chapter, you learned about Lepen of the Church of the East, who was a missionary priest. And in 635 AD, he arrives in China and begins preaching the gospel in Tang Dynasty, China. Here's a picture of the Silk Road that Lepen most likely followed. And you could see that in this time period, the Silk Road could take you from all the way from the Roman Empire through the Arabian Peninsula, through Persia, up and over the Himalayas into China. So it's very believable that Christianity could travel along this important trade route. Here is a artistic piece that's been done from an early scroll in this period of an ancient baptism in China, where a man is being baptized, and you can see the picture of the dove here representing the Holy Spirit and the light coming down onto this new believer who's been baptized. So the Nestorian Church is sometimes understood in Christianity as the religion of light. The religion of light. Here's another piece of art depicting Lepen teaching Christianity to the leaders of China in the Tang Dynasty. And it's notable that Lepen was an early contextualizer of the gospel, which means to put the gospel into local cultural terms. Lepen noticed the success of Buddhism in this period. So like Buddhists, Lepen focused on the building of monasteries and then writing Christian truth in sutras that was a poetic form. So he would share Christianity in the model of a sutra. And it achieved a lot of success for him and his followers in this time. Lepen, the Nestorian missionary to China. We can see historical evidence of Lepen's work in China during this period with the Nestorian stele, which is another word for monument, and it was erected in 781 AD by the Tang Dynasty, and it narrates 150 years of Christianity in China to Lepen's arrival in 635 AD. So although many people often say, oh, Christianity is a foreign religion to Asia, it's brought by European colonizers and powers, the Nestorian Monument proves that that is not true, that Christianity is also an Asian religion that was in Tang Dynasty China during this time period. And if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to read more about the Nestorian Monument. And for those of you that can read Chinese characters, it'd be very interesting to do a study of this. Now, we move into the first period of major decline for Christianity in Asia. With the rise of Islam in the Middle East in the 600s, which we saw the devastating impact that had on Christians in northern Africa in previous lectures, we can see that Christianity declines greatly under Muslim rule in the Arab-controlled lands throughout Asia. So the rise of Islam brings a decline of Christianity in Asia. And also in China, we saw the success in previous slides of Lepen's mission, Nestorian mission to China. But in 843 AD, Buddhism is then banned in China, and Christianity is later banned in 845 AD as the Tang Dynasty becomes suspicious of everything not traditionally Chinese. You can read that in Global Gospel, page 152. So after these two periods of expansion between the birth of Christianity to 500 and then from 500 to 1000, especially with the missionary activity on the Silk Road, Christianity goes into a major decline between 650 AD and 1100 AD with the rise of Islam, and then also with China banning Christianity as well as Buddhism in this time period. However, we then see another brief expansion or growth period of Christianity between 1000 and 1300 AD as local Christian merchants continue to share their faith on the Silk Road, and some local tribes convert to Christianity, again through the evangelism that's happening along the Silk Road. Also during this period, early Catholic missionaries, Western Catholic missionaries, begin to arrive, of folks like John of Plano Carpini, who arrived in Central Asia in 1245. And during this period, Global Gospel shows us that some Mongol leaders converted to Christianity. And there was a point that it looked like the Mongolian kingdom, the great Khan himself, was considering Christianity. However, he converted to Islam, and that led to a great persecution of Christians during those years. So from 1000 to 1300, we see a brief expansion of Christianity, again with missionaries along the Silk Road and the beginning of Catholic missionaries into the area. Yet also around this time, there's an overlap here. There's another great decline from 1100 to 1500 within Christianity in Asia, and this is due to the European Crusades, in which European crusaders begin in the 11th century to come in and try to retake Jerusalem in different lands in Asia. And the first crusade is successful, but then there's a tremendous backlash, and none of the future crusades are successful. And due to this backlash, there's almost a complete removal of Christianity in Central Asia. However, some Christian communities survive and remain in Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and southern India. But we can see, as we looked at earlier today, that this Middle Eastern portion of Asia remains with a very low population of Christians today. And this can be contributed back to the backlash to the Crusades. Then Global Gospel shows us that there's then a fourth growth period of Christianity from 1500 to 1700 AD, when European, especially Catholic missionaries, start arriving from Portugal and Spain. And there was a Portuguese delegation arriving in India to scope out the land in 1498. This soon follows with the arrival of the Jesuits, the Great Society of Jesus, and Portuguese Jesuit Francis Xavier, who arrives in India in 1542, and then Japan in 1549. Now, the Jesuits were early contextualizers of the gospel because they studied local practices and beliefs and then explained Christianity in local cultural terms. So as compared to other mission movements, they were a very successful mission movement of explaining Christianity in a way that locals could understand using their culture and ideas. This is a portrait of Xavier arriving in Kagoshima in 1549, touching base in Japan. And there was a period of time during this period in Japan, sometimes referred to as the Christian century, when the population of Christians in Japan could have been as high as 10% of the population. However, there is soon a third decline in Christianity in Asia between 1600 and 1800 AD that begins in Japan, when in 1614 the Tokugawa shogunate bans Christianity and sees it as a foreign invasive religion that's creating disorder. And from this point on, the Christians in Japan become Kakure Kurishitan, known as the hidden Christians in English, and go underground and survive for over 2 centuries until the middle 1800s, after Sakoku policy ends and Catholic and Protestant missionaries begin to re-enter Japan in the mid-1800s. And many of you may be familiar with the monument to the 26 martyrs of Japan in February 5th, 1597, in Nagasaki. And so this persecution in Christians in Japan begins in the late 1500s and then culminates in 1614 with the Tokugawa shogunate banning Christianity in Japan. At the same time, in other parts of Asia, there are rivalries among Catholic missionaries in Asia. Some Catholic groups thought the Jesuits were too comfortable with local cultural ideas and with the cultural elite, and they disagree with them. And there are rivalries that begin among the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Jesuits that leads to a decline of Christianity during this time. And yet, we see once again, after a period of decline, a period of growth. So the 5th growth period of Christianity in Asia begins with Protestant missions in the late 1700s, and this takes us up to the present day today. So we can read about in Global Gospel the English Baptist William Carey, who arrives in India in 1793, and he begins a wave of Protestant missionaries into Asia who focus on evangelism, education, the building of schools and Christian Bible translation into local languages, and social justice. And today here in Japan, these mission schools, of which Aoyama Gakuin University is part of, are part of this wave of the 5th period of growth of Christianity in Asia. Aoyama Gakuin, which is a very well-known and successful mission school in Japan, comes out of the Methodist tradition. There's also Meiji Gakuin University, where I used to work about 20 years ago, which is from the Presbyterian tradition, as well as Seigakuin University, which is well known in Japan today, which comes out of the Disciples of Christ tradition. So these 3 schools in Japan, Aoyama Gakuin, Meiji Gakuin Daigaku, and Seigakuin, all come out of this Protestant mission movement that begins with Carey in 1793. And today in Asia, we are in another recent growth period of Christianity in Asia. So although Asia has had times of growth and decline, expansion and contraction, today in the 21st century, we are living in a time of growth of Christianity in Asia. In 1900, there were 20 million Christians in Asia, but now today, from these statistics in 2016, we can measure 400 million Christians in Asia. That is a huge increase of Christians in this region in roughly 1 century. 30% of Asia's Christians are Pentecostal, and Pentecostal churches are growing in Asia. And as part of this recent growth of Christianity in Asia, Global Gospel shows us at the end of the chapter that there are 10 countries with the most Christians in the world, and the top 3 are in Asia. China has roughly 100 million Christians, the Philippines with 93 million Christians, and India with 63 million Christians, followed by the USA, Brazil, Mexico, Russia, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ethiopia. But it is amazing that the top 3 countries in this list are in Asia, and that points to the future of Christianity in Asia. Even though there are only 15% of the world's Christians in Asia, Asia, as we've shown earlier, is a huge area, 60% of world population, and the top 3 countries with Christian population in the world are in Asia. And I think that points prophetically to the future growth of Christianity in this important region. Also, I wanted to just point out the role of some well-known Asian theologians, which you can read about at the end of chapter 6, one being Bishop K.H. Ching, who was a very important Chinese Protestant church leader in the 20th century. In the 80s and 90s, he was head of the China Christian Council, and for over 40 years, he was president of Nanjing Union Theological Seminary. And he is very well known and a bit controversial when you compare him to more conservative Chinese house church leaders. He was known for promoting a positive and cooperative relationship between Chinese Christians and the Communist Party. And that is a controversial stand, and yet he is still a theologian that has shown that Chinese Christians could coexist with Communist Party leaders and ideals. So that's Bishop K.H. Ching. You can read more about him and his ideas at the end of the chapter, Global Gospel, chapter 6 on Asia. Also, Jacobson has some brief introduction to Kosuke Koyama, who is a well-known Japanese Protestant theologian who was born in 1929 and passed away in 2009. He is known for his work on discussing the relationship between Christianity and Asian religions, and he would be one who could describe the contextualization of the gospel, of expressing the gospel in local cultural terms. He's quoted in Global Gospel as saying, "Religions artificially mixed will be deprived of genuine spiritual power." So Koyama emphasized the importance of relating the gospel truth in local cultural terms. And he served as a missionary of the Nihon Kiristo Kyodan in Thailand, and that inspired his well-known book, Water Buffalo Theology. So although he encourages people to share the gospel in the ideas and terms of the local culture, he stands against religious syncretism when religions are just mixed together, which in Koyama's words deprive them of genuine spiritual power. And this is an important idea in a place like Asia, where so many religions coexist. It's very easy to mix them artificially, but we need to remember from the Christian gospel perspective that the gospel should be transmitted into the local culture in ways that the people can understand, but still be distinctly Christian religion that can lead people to the truth and power in Christ. Okay, that wraps up our lecture for today. That's a brief overview of the growth and decline and now recent growth of Christianity in Asia. Global Gospel, again, is a very thick, the chapter on Asia is a very thick chapter, so if you had trouble understanding all that, I hope this lecture has helped you break down some of the main themes. And I would like you to complete these survey questions by this Saturday night at 9 p.m. Number 1, what countries have you visited in Asia? What is your impression of Christianity in Asia? 2, why do you think the history of Christianity in Asia is a pattern of growth and decline? 3, what do you think of the future of Christianity in Japan as Christianity grows in some Asian countries like China and India? So please work on those survey questions and complete them via Course Power by this Saturday night at 9 p.m. And I'd also encourage you, it's not required, but I encourage you to watch the video Global Christianity Asia that Dr. Jacobson has posted on YouTube from his lectures at Messiah College in the United States from, I think, around 2014. But this is posted in Course Power and will give you more detail into the thick chapter that we've looked at in Global Gospel. Also, I want to thank many of you for sending in your chapel reports. We need to have 3 chapel reports by the end of the spring semester. And many of you, almost all of you, have submitted at least 1 report, and many of you have submitted 3 reports. Thank you very much. And I will be acknowledging that as soon as I can, but I'm able to see it right away on Course Power, so thank you very much. Please submit your remaining chapel reports by Tuesday, August 11th. Next week, this should be Some of you might find this is good news. There will be no video lecture next week on July 28th, 2020. I'd like you to take next week's lecture time to work on your church visit report. This is your church visit report, not the online chapel at Aoyama Gakuin, but you are to find a church in Tokyo or wherever you're living. I know some of you are living overseas right now. Find a local church, and if you can, and if you're comfortable with social distancing, go and visit the church worship service. And you may have to make a reservation to do that because some churches are taking reservations to limit the number of people who are attending the worship service. But many churches have their services recorded online, so you can visit a church worship service online and then make a report. Well, we've come to the end of our lecture 12 on Christianity in Asia today, and I just again want to remind you that next week there will not be a video lecture next week, but you are to work on your church visit report, which means attending a Christian church for a Sunday worship service, online or in person. One student asked me a couple of weeks ago about some possible churches to view online, and so I wanted to put these links here for you. This is Grace City Church, Pastor Fukuda Makoto, which is meeting near Tokyo Station. It's a Protestant church. The churches I serve, Redeemer Church of Roppongi, we're actually in a network with this church, and they have great online church services in Japanese. So I would encourage you to go to www.gracecitychurch.jp, and you can view many of their online worship services. Also, another church based in Kichijoji is called Double O Cross Church. The pastor's name is Kimura Ryuta. He's a great guy. He's very bilingual, and you can view their worship services. They're a Protestant church in both English and Japanese, I believe. And then also, if you're looking for more churches, if you go to Dr. Paul Shu's website, Shu Kenkyu Shitsu, and look on this link, you will see the many churches that he lists for his Introduction to Christianity classes. He lists many churches for them to go to and for their church worship reports. So again, I would encourage you to do a church worship report by listening to an online service, unless you're comfortable and would like to go out to a church that is actually worshiping publicly, and some are beginning to do that at this stage. So please look at the church worship report that I've put up on CoursePower, and you can type it up as a one-page report. It's a similar format to the chapel report, but with just more detail. Okay, so that's available to you now on CoursePower, but I've made the report due on August 8th. I decided to give you more time, so next week there's no video lecture, and I want you to view a church worship service online, or potentially go to church this Sunday the 26th, or you could also go on Sunday, August 2nd, and I'm giving you until August 8th to write that up as a one-page typed report. You'll see the format on CoursePower and submit that by midnight on August 8th. Well, I want to thank you very much for viewing these videos, and I really appreciate the efforts that you're putting into this class. Many of you are writing great comments on the survey questions, which also function as your attendance. So once you've done that survey question by Saturday night after the lecture, you have attendance for the class. Thank you for how you're grappling with these issues. And I pray that you have a good visit to a church worship service, either online or in person. And then we will regather on August 4th, will be our next video lecture for Christianity in North America. And then the following week, August 11th, is our last lecture of the semester, in which I will give some concluding thoughts, and we will also potentially have a time of question and answer. That's a possibility. And then also you will have one final reflection paper that will be due on the 15th of August. So don't worry about this course. The majority of you are doing the work, and it's just keeping up with the different assignments, especially the survey questions, and your church and chapel reports. And thank you all for the reflection papers that you've already submitted several weeks ago. I have the majority of you have submitted that, and we will just have one more reflection paper that will not be too difficult by the end of the course. The most important thing is for you to be seeing how Christianity has grown around the world as the world's largest religion, the way it has grown in different regions of the world, and today we saw how it's both grown and contracted and is now in another period of growth here in Asia. So I hope you've been able to see how Christianity has developed into this multicultural global movement. You can email me with any questions, and I just want to thank you for what you're putting into this course and wish you well for a good semester, and I will see you 2 weeks from now on Tuesday evening, August 4th, with another video lecture. So next week you have a week off, but please take that time to work on your church worship report. Thank you very much, and take care.